Most prisons are built to be forgotten. Alcatraz was built to be seen. Less than 2 miles from San Francisco, this island sat in constant view of freedom, close enough to hear the city, yet completely unreachable. Cold water, violent currents, and open distance did the work of walls. Alcatraz was not designed to break men through brutality. It broke certainty. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no future beyond the rock beneath your feet. This island was not just a prison, it was a line where American authority decided who could remain within society and who would be placed beyond it. Alcatraz Island rises from the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, not as a natural refuge, but as a deliberate interruption in space. Long before it became synonymous with punishment and isolation, the island existed as a geological intrusion. Bare rock, treeless, surrounded by shifting tides and sharp currents that resisted easy crossing. Its power has always been spatial before it was institutional. Distance, visibility, and separation defined Alcatraz centuries before walls, cells, or watchtowers were built upon it. In this sense, Alcatraz belongs to a longer human tradition, the use of geography itself as a tool of authority. Power did not need to announce itself loudly here. It only needed to be placed where escape was unthinkable. When Spanish explorers entered San Francisco Bay in the late 18th century, they named the island La Isla de los Alcatraces, after the seabirds that claimed its cliffs. The name carried no implication of punishment, yet from the beginning of European presence, the island was read through a strategic lens. Isolated, elevated, and commanding clear sightlines across the bay's narrow entrance, it offered surveillance before confinement, dominance before discipline. Space came first, meaning followed. In this ordering lies the foundation of American confinement architecture. Control achieved not merely by force, but by environment. The United States inherited this logic after the Mexican-American War, when California became American territory in 1848. Within 2 years, Alcatraz was claimed by the U.S. Army and designated as a military reservation. The timing was not accidental. The California gold rush had transformed San Francisco into a volatile convergence of wealth, labor, violence, and ambition. The bay was no longer peripheral. It was a gateway to economic promise. Alcatraz was positioned precisely where authority needed to be visible. Fortification, not incarceration, defined its early architecture. Cannons were mounted along the island's perimeter. Defensive walls were shaped to repel foreign navies rather than hold human bodies. Yet even in this martial phase, Alcatraz rehearsed the spatial grammar of confinement. It separated danger from the city while remaining permanently within sight of it. The first permanent structures were built not to hide power, but to display it. Alcatraz's elevation ensured that its presence could not be ignored. From the growing city of San Francisco, the island appeared small but unmistakable, its pale stone structures catching the light while remaining unreachable. This visual paradox, nearness without access, would later become central to its psychological function as a prison. But initially it symbolized protection. The island guarded the bay, and by extension, the fragile American claim to the Pacific coast. During the Civil War, Alcatraz's role began to shift. The cannons remained, but their purpose became increasingly symbolic as naval warfare evolved. The island's true utility lay elsewhere. Political prisoners, Confederate sympathizers, and military offenders were detained there, marking the beginning of Alcatraz's transformation from fort to carceral space. Importantly, this shift did not require a radical architectural overhaul. The structures designed for defense were easily adapted for confinement. Barracks became cells. Storage rooms became holding areas. The island's geography did most of the work. The water replaced walls. The distance replaced chains. This adaptability reveals a critical truth about confinement architecture. It is often born from existing power structures rather than designed from scratch. Alcatraz was not envisioned as a prison in the abstract. It became one because its spatial conditions aligned with emerging philosophies of control. By the late 19th century, American incarceration was moving away from public spectacle toward controlled isolation. Prisons were no longer stages for punishment. They were instruments of order. Silence, separation, and surveillance replaced pain as the dominant tools. Alcatraz fit this transformation seamlessly. As the U.S. military prison expanded in the late 1800s, new structures were added that further disciplined space. Cell houses were arranged to maximize visibility. Movement was restricted not only by locks, but by narrow corridors and controlled sightlines. Authority became architectural. Guards did not need to assert dominance constantly. The environment performed it continuously. Every wall, every barred window, every measured distance reinforced hierarchy. The island itself became an extension of the institution, erasing any meaningful boundary between natural and constructed confinement. Yet Alcatraz was never hidden. Unlike remote frontier prisons, it remained embedded within the rhythms of urban life. Ferries passed nearby. Lights from the city flickered across the water at night. Music, laughter, and celebration carried faintly across the bay. This proximity intensified the island's psychological weight. Inmates were not removed from civilization. They were positioned just outside it. The architecture of Alcatraz thus created a uniquely American form of punishment: exclusion without disappearance. Those confined were not forgotten. They were displayed silently as evidence of order. By the early 20th century, this symbolism had hardened. Alcatraz was no longer merely a military prison, it was an idea. The island represented the outer limit of discipline, the place where authority could withdraw its tolerance. When the federal government later assumed control and transformed Alcatraz into a maximum security penitentiary, it did not need to invent a new narrative. The groundwork had already been laid in stone, water, and distance. The architecture had spoken for decades. The evolution of Alcatraz's physical form reveals how American confinement did not emerge from cruelty alone, but from an obsession with control through design. The island's power lay not in its brutality, but in its inevitability. Escape seemed not merely difficult, but conceptually impossible. The bay was cold. The currents were strong. The island was always visible. Confinement was total not because it was violent, but because it was absolute. Alcatraz did not need to threaten. It only needed to exist. This first chapter of Alcatraz's history is therefore not about criminals, legends, or escape attempts. It is about how space itself became an instrument of governance. Before the first civilian inmate arrived, before the name became feared, the island had already fulfilled its purpose. It had taught America how to confine without spectacle, how to dominate without chaos, and how to turn geography into policy. What followed would merely refine this lesson, sharpening it into one of the most enduring symbols of American authority ever built. When Alcatraz formally transitioned from a military installation to a federal penitentiary in the early 1930s, the change was presented not as an escalation of punishment, but as a necessity of order. The United States was entering a period marked by economic collapse, mass unemployment, and public anxiety over crime. The Great Depression did not simply strain financial systems, it strained faith in institutions. Bank robberies, prison escapes, and the emergence of nationally known criminals exposed weaknesses in America's carceral network. Alcatraz was selected not because it could be made harsher than other prisons, but because it already embodied finality. It was a place designed to end problems, not rehabilitate them. This distinction mattered. Federal officials repeatedly emphasized that Alcatraz was not meant for the general prison population. It was intended for inmates who disrupted discipline elsewhere, those who resisted authority, organized escapes, or undermined control through violence or defiance. In architectural terms, Alcatraz was conceived as a prison for prisons. It did not replace existing institutions. It reinforced them by existing as an ultimate consequence. Its power lay as much in its reputation as in its walls. The physical transformation that followed was careful and restrained. The island's existing structures were reinforced rather than replaced. The main cell house, later known as Cell House A, was modernized with steel bars, reinforced concrete, and upgraded utilities. Contrary to popular imagery, the cells were not unusually small by contemporary standards. What distinguished them was not size but context. Each cell measured isolation precisely. Narrow corridors limited movement. The arrangement allowed guards to observe long rows of inmates simultaneously, reducing the need for force. Control was embedded in visibility. The island's layout reflected evolving philosophies of incarceration that prioritized predictability over punishment. Silence was enforced not through constant surveillance, but through the knowledge that every sound carried. The architecture amplified awareness. Inmates understood that any disruption would echo, both literally and administratively. Discipline became internalized. This was not accidental. American prison reformers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries increasingly believed that order was best maintained when authority appeared omnipresent, but rarely exercised overtly. Alcatraz also formalized separation as policy. Inmates were cut off not only from society, but from one another. Social hierarchies, common in other prisons, were deliberately weakened. Meals were taken silently. Recreation was limited and controlled. Work assignments were repetitive and isolated. The environment discouraged collective identity. Each inmate existed as an individual under observation, rather than a member of a shared population. This fragmentation reduced the risk of organized resistance while reinforcing the psychological experience of solitude. Yet the island was never entirely silent. The sounds of San Francisco remained present, particularly at night. Music from dance halls, the horns of ships, and the distant noise of celebration crossed the water. This auditory proximity to freedom was not designed, but it became integral to the prison's psychological landscape. Inmates later recalled that seeing the city lights while remaining unreachable intensified confinement. Freedom was not abstract, it was visible, audible, and deliberately withheld. The federal government understood the symbolic value of this arrangement. Alcatraz was publicized carefully. Official statements emphasized security, discipline, and inevitability. Escape was portrayed as impossible not through exaggeration, but through statistics. Cold water temperatures, strong currents, and distance from shore. The island's geography was repeatedly invoked as evidence that confinement here was beyond challenge. The message was clear. Authority was not negotiable. The inmates sent to Alcatraz reinforced this narrative. Many were already known to the public through newspapers and court records. Their presence transformed the island into a national spectacle, even as the institution itself avoided overt theatricality. Alcatraz did not stage punishment. It absorbed notoriety. Criminal fame dissolved within its walls, replaced by anonymity enforced through routine. Names became numbers. Reputations ended at the shoreline. This erasure of identity was central to the prison's function. Alcatraz did not seek to reform through education or labor. It sought compliance through deprivation of status. Inmates were stripped of influence rather than subjected to constant physical hardship. Food was adequate. Medical care was available. Violence was relatively rare compared to other prisons of the era. What Alcatraz removed was agency. The ability to affect one's environment disappeared. Every aspect of daily life followed institutional rhythm. Time itself became an instrument of control. Architecturally, the island reinforced this temporal discipline. Bells, schedules, and routines structured existence. Days blended into one another. The bay's constant movement contrasted sharply with the static interior of the cell house. Outside, tides shifted endlessly. Inside, nothing changed. This contrast deepened the sensation of suspension, as if inmates existed outside normal time. Alcatraz's role within the broader American penal system was thus paradoxical. It was both exceptional and exemplary. Few inmates were sent there, yet its influence extended far beyond its population. Wardens elsewhere invoked it as a warning. Administrators used it as leverage. The threat of transfer carried weight precisely because Alcatraz was real, visible, and final. Its architecture did not merely confine bodies, it disciplined institutions. By the late 1930s, Alcatraz had fully assumed its role as a symbol of absolute authority. Its physical form had changed little, but its meaning had hardened. The island no longer represented defense or military strength. It represented the state's capacity to withdraw tolerance entirely. To be sent to Alcatraz was to reach the edge of administrative patience. Beyond it, there was nowhere else to go. Yet even at the height of its power, the island's future was already constrained by the same forces that had made it effective. Isolation was expensive. Maintenance was difficult. Water, fuel, and supplies had to be transported constantly. The architecture that made Alcatraz formidable also made it fragile. Control came at a cost, and that cost would eventually reshape its fate. For now, however, Alcatraz stood as the physical expression of an American belief. That order could be preserved through distance, visibility, and inevitability. The island did not shout this belief. It demonstrated it quietly, day after day, as the city watched from across the water. Life inside Alcatraz was governed not by constant punishment, but by consistency. The institution's authority depended on routine so stable that it dissolved resistance before it could form. Each day unfolded according to a fixed sequence of movements, sounds, and silences. Wake-up calls, counts, meals, work details, and lockdowns followed one another with mechanical precision. The predictability was intentional. Inmates were not meant to anticipate change. They were meant to surrender to structure. Cells were individual, narrow, and spare, containing little more than a bed, a small fold-down shelf, and a toilet with cold running water. This was not an oversight. Warm water was deliberately withheld as a reminder that comfort was conditional. The architecture communicated hierarchy without words. Privilege, when granted, appeared fragile and revocable. Inmates learned quickly that compliance preserved stability, while defiance introduced uncertainty. Despite its reputation, Alcatraz did not rely heavily on physical violence. Records show relatively low rates of assault compared to other federal prisons of the era. This absence of chaos was not evidence of leniency. It reflected a deeper form of control. The prison was designed to remove opportunities for conflict. Separation, visibility, and isolation reduced friction. Silence was enforced through expectation rather than force. Those who violated it were disciplined swiftly, but usually quietly. The most severe punishment was not physical restraint, but intensified isolation. Solitary confinement, known as the hole, stripped inmates of even the limited stimuli available in the main cell house. Darkness, reduced rations, and sensory deprivation served as reminders that confinement could always be made smaller. The hole functioned less as retribution than as deterrence. Its existence reinforced boundaries without frequent use. Alcatraz's population included individuals whose names were already embedded in American criminal folklore. Yet within the institution, notoriety carried little value. The architecture flattened identity. Public fascination with inmates such as Al Capone or George Machine Gun Kelly existed outside the island, not within it. Inside, these men performed the same routines as everyone else. Fame dissolved into anonymity. The institution's power lay in its refusal to acknowledge distinction. This erasure was deeply psychological. Inmates were denied the ability to perform identity, whether violent or charismatic. They could not intimidate through reputation, nor organize through influence. Control was achieved by removing platforms for expression. Even work assignments, such as laundry or kitchen duty, were structured to minimize interaction. Cooperation was necessary, but individuality was irrelevant. The soundscape of Alcatraz reinforced this inward collapse. The constant rhythm of the bay contrasted with the stillness of the cell house. Wind rattled windows. Water slapped against rock. Foghorns echoed at irregular intervals. These natural sounds were not comforting. They emphasized distance. The world beyond the island was alive, moving, and different. Inside, time slowed. This contrast shaped memory. Former inmates later recalled that the most painful aspect of confinement was not deprivation, but awareness. Seeing families picnicking along the shore, hearing music drift across the water, watching ferries move freely through the bay, all of this sharpened longing. Freedom was not imagined. It was observed daily and denied continuously. Alcatraz perfected proximity without access. The institution also functioned as a performance for those who ran it. Guards lived on the island with their families, occupying quarters separate from the cell house, yet bound to its presence. Children grew up playing beneath watchtowers, normalizing surveillance as part of domestic life. Authority was not only exercised, it was lived. The island blurred boundaries between governance and everyday existence. This coexistence reinforced legitimacy. Guards did not appear as distant enforcers. They were neighbors, parents, workers, embedded within the same geography. The prison's architecture accommodated this duality. Residential buildings were designed to provide comfort without indulgence. mirroring the institution's broader philosophy: order sustained through balance, not excess. Over time, however, this balance grew fragile. The costs of maintaining Alcatraz increased steadily. Infrastructure aged. Salt air corroded metal. Fresh water had to be transported daily. Supplies required constant logistical coordination. The same isolation that made Alcatraz effective also made it inefficient. As federal prison policy evolved toward larger inland facilities, the island's limitations became more apparent. Yet its symbolic value remained immense. Alcatraz continued to function less as a correctional institution and more as a statement. It represented the outer boundary of tolerance, the place reserved for those deemed unreachable by reform. This role was sustainable only as long as the state accepted the cost of maintaining such a symbol. By the early 1960s, that calculation began to shift. The island's authority was no longer unquestioned. Maintenance reports highlighted deterioration. Administrative reviews questioned necessity. The architecture that once embodied permanence now revealed vulnerability. Control through isolation was proving expensive, both financially and philosophically. Alcatraz's strength had always been its absoluteness. When that absoluteness weakened, the institution's purpose faltered. What followed was not collapse but reassessment, a recognition that confinement, like all expressions of power, is shaped by context. The island that once defined inevitability was approaching the limits of its relevance. The closure of Alcatraz in 1963 was not announced as a failure of discipline, but as a matter of practicality. Official statements cited deteriorating infrastructure, rising costs, and logistical inefficiency. Saltwater corrosion had weakened steel. Concrete cracked under constant exposure. Supplying the island with fresh water and fuel required daily transport. By administrative calculation, Alcatraz cost several times more per inmate than comparable federal prisons on the mainland. Yet these explanations, while accurate, masked a deeper shift. The island was becoming misaligned with the evolving logic of American confinement. By the mid-20th century, the federal prison system had begun to emphasize scale, standardization, and inland containment. New facilities were designed to hold thousands rather than hundreds, located far from population centers and coastlines. Control was increasingly achieved through bureaucratic systems rather than symbolic geography. Alcatraz, with its visibility and singularity, belonged to an earlier era. Its authority was theatrical in a way modern administration no longer required. When the last inmates were transferred off the island, Alcatraz did not disappear. Its meaning simply changed. The physical structures remained, but their function dissolved. Cells that once held men now stood empty, their bars intact yet purposeless. The silence that followed was different from the silence imposed. It was no longer enforced. It was residual. The island entered a liminal state, suspended between memory and neglect. This period of abandonment exposed the fragility of carceral architecture once authority withdraws. Without routine, the island decayed rapidly. Paint peeled, metal rusted, interiors deteriorated. The same environment that had disciplined inmates now eroded the institution itself. Power, once removed, left no self-sustaining order behind. The architecture required constant reinforcement to remain meaningful. Public perception shifted quickly. What had once been feared became curious. What had symbolized inevitability now appeared finite. Alcatraz transitioned from instrument to artifact. Visitors no longer approached it as a boundary, but as a destination. The island's meaning inverted. It no longer excluded. It invited observation. This transformation was not merely cultural, it was political. In 1969, a group of Native American activists occupied Alcatraz, asserting a claim grounded in treaty law and historical injustice. For 19 months, the island became a site of protest rather than punishment. The occupation reframed Alcatraz's history, linking it to broader narratives of dispossession, surveillance, and state power. Confinement was no longer seen solely through the lens of crime, but through colonial legacy. The occupation exposed continuity beneath change. Alcatraz had always been a place where authority imposed separation. Now it became a place where marginalized voices demanded recognition. The architecture remained the same. The meaning reversed. Cells that once confined bodies now housed arguments. Surveillance structures that once monitored inmates were repurposed to attract attention. When the occupation ended, Alcatraz entered its final institutional form, preservation. The National Park Service assumed responsibility, stabilizing structures while allowing decay to remain visible. This decision was deliberate. Restoration without erasure acknowledged history without sanitizing it. Visitors would see rust, cracks, and weathered walls. The island would speak through its deterioration. As a museum, Alcatraz functions differently than it did as a prison, yet it continues to exert influence. Its architecture still communicates authority, but now as memory rather than enforcement. Visitors move through cells freely, yet remain conscious of constraint. The space encourages reflection rather than compliance. The bay still surrounds the island. The distance still matters, but the meaning has shifted from exclusion to examination. This evolution mirrors broader changes in how societies understand confinement. Prisons no longer rely primarily on symbolic geography. They operate through systems less visible, but no less powerful. Alcatraz's prominence endures precisely because it belonged to a moment when authority needed to be seen to be believed. Its isolation was legible. Its boundaries were clear. Today, Alcatraz stands as a reminder that architecture is never neutral. Space reflects values. Distance communicates intent. The island's history traces the arc of American confinement from visibility to bureaucracy, from spectacle to administration. Its rise and decline mark the limits of using geography as governance. What remains is not merely a former prison, but a question embedded in stone. How does a society choose to confine? Where does it draw its boundaries? And what happens when the structures built to enforce order outlive the authority that created them? Alcatraz offers no answers. It offers evidence. In its afterlife as a preserved site, Alcatraz did not lose its disciplinary presence. It redistributed it. The island's authority no longer operated through enforcement, yet it continued to shape behavior through narrative and design. Visitors followed prescribed paths, listened to curated audio accounts, and encountered carefully framed silences. Movement remained guided. Attention remained directed. The architecture still governed experience, but now through interpretation rather than command. Confinement had evolved into memory management. This transformation reveals a critical continuity in American institutional power. When coercion recedes, interpretation advances. Alcatraz's cell house, preserved with minimal alteration, functions as a text that instructs without ordering. Bars remain locked not to restrain bodies but to stabilize meaning. The spatial hierarchy, cells below, guards walkways above, still organizes perception. Visitors instinctively lower their voices, pause in doorways, and measure distance. The body responds even when authority does not demand it. Architecture remembers its function. The island's visibility continues to matter. From the city, Alcatraz still occupies the same position in the bay, still framed by water and sky. What has changed is the direction of the gaze. The city now looks toward the island as a site of reflection rather than fear. This reversal does not erase power, it reframes it. Alcatraz becomes a mirror, reflecting how authority once positioned itself in relation to the public. The island's nearness underscores a lesson that remains relevant. Confinement works best when it is seen. This visibility distinguishes Alcatraz from the modern carceral landscape. Contemporary prisons are deliberately distant, geographically, socially, and politically. They are placed inland, beyond tourist routes and urban sightlines. Their architecture is functional rather than symbolic, standardized rather than monumental. Control operates through scale, data, and administrative layering. Alcatraz belongs to an earlier philosophy, one that believed power required presence. Its endurance as a cultural site suggests that this older logic still resonates. The narratives presented at Alcatraz emphasize daily life, routine, and atmosphere rather than sensationalism. This curatorial choice aligns with the island's historical function. The prison's impact was never rooted in spectacle, it was rooted in constancy. By foregrounding routine, the site resists mythologizing escape attempts or notorious inmates as central themes. Instead, it reinforces the institutional perspective. order maintained through repetition and design. Yet the island also exposes contradictions. Alcatraz is celebrated as a historical landmark while representing a system that prioritized exclusion over rehabilitation. Visitors are invited to admire the ingenuity of control without endorsing its outcomes. This tension is not resolved by the site, it is preserved. The cracks in the walls become metaphors for unresolved questions about punishment, authority, and responsibility. The Native American occupation remains a crucial counter-narrative within this preserved space. It disrupts linear interpretation by reasserting that Alcatraz was not merely a prison, but part of a longer continuum of state control over land and bodies. The occupation reframed the island as contested ground, reminding visitors that authority is never singular. Space can be reclaimed, even if temporarily, and meaning can be inverted. In this sense, Alcatraz functions as a palimpsest. Military fortification, prison, protest site, and museum coexist within the same physical boundaries. Each layer alters how the next is understood. The island's architecture does not privilege one narrative conclusively. It holds them in tension. The bay surrounds all of them equally. What Alcatraz ultimately demonstrates is the endurance of spatial authority. Even stripped of prisoners, guards, and administrative function, the island continues to shape thought. It asks how environments discipline behavior, how visibility enforces compliance, and how distance communicates exclusion. These questions extend beyond the island into the broader American landscape of confinement. As debates over incarceration, surveillance, and institutional power continue, Alcatraz remains instructive precisely because it is no longer active. Its silence allows patterns to emerge clearly. It reveals how architecture can naturalize authority, how geography can substitute for force, and how institutions rely on space to sustain legitimacy. The evolution of American confinement did not abandon these principles, it refined them. Alcatraz marks an early culmination, not an endpoint. To understand its history is to recognize that confinement is never only about walls and bars. It is about how societies arrange distance, visibility, and inevitability. The island endures because these arrangements persist. Alcatraz's endurance in public memory rests not on nostalgia, but on recognition. The island survives because it reveals patterns that remain operative long after its closure. In the broader evolution of American confinement, Alcatraz marks a transition point, a moment when authority was still willing to be visible, when discipline relied on spatial clarity rather than procedural obscurity. Understanding this moment clarifies what followed. As the federal prison system expanded after World War II, the logic that had shaped Alcatraz was not abandoned. It was redistributed. Distance remained essential, but it was achieved through remoteness rather than water. Visibility was reduced rather than emphasized. Surveillance became internalized through bureaucratic layers, risk assessments, and classification systems. Where Alcatraz once communicated inevitability through geography, modern confinement communicates it through administration. This shift altered how power was experienced. Inmates in later institutions encountered authority less as a place and more as a process. Control no longer resided primarily in walls, but in paperwork, schedules, and discretionary decisions. Alcatraz's architecture had made power legible. Later systems made it abstract. This abstraction reduced public scrutiny even as confinement expanded dramatically across the United States. The island's preservation therefore performs a critical historical function. It externalizes what later institutions conceal. Visitors can see, measure, and inhabit the spaces where authority once operated openly. The narrow cells, elevated walkways, and omnipresent bay reveal how little was required to establish dominance when design aligned with intent. Alcatraz demonstrates that confinement need not be excessive to be absolute. This lesson complicates contemporary discussions of punishment. The question is no longer whether confinement is harsh, but whether it is visible. Alcatraz reminds observers that systems of control gain legitimacy when they are seen, debated, and understood. When they disappear from view, they become easier to expand and harder to challenge. The island's continued prominence thus serves as an unintended critique of modern incarceration. There is also a human cost embedded in this history that resists quantification. Alcatraz's relatively small population did not diminish its psychological impact. The institution functioned as a deterrent precisely because of its symbolic weight. Fear extended beyond those confined to those who merely imagined confinement. This diffusion of authority illustrates how punishment operates socially, not only individually. Former inmates' accounts consistently emphasize monotony rather than brutality. Days blurred, identity eroded, time stretched. These experiences reflect the prison's design priorities. Alcatraz sought not to break bodies but to neutralize disruption. In doing so, it exposed a fundamental tension within American confinement. Order achieved at the expense of agency. This tension persists. Modern systems continue to balance security against autonomy, efficiency against humanity. Alcatraz offers no solutions, but it clarifies stakes. Its history demonstrates that architecture is never incidental. Every decision about space, distance, and access encodes values. The island's isolation expressed a belief that some problems are best removed from view, yet kept symbolically present. Standing on Alcatraz today, one confronts absence as much as structure. The cells are empty. The corridors echo. The authority that once animated the island has withdrawn. Yet the questions remain intact. What does it mean to confine? Who decides where the boundaries lie? And how long can power rely on space before space begins to speak back? Alcatraz endures because it forces these questions into visibility. It cannot be ignored, precisely because it was designed never to be escaped. In that paradox lies its legacy. The island that once defined the limits of American tolerance now defines the limits of forgetting. The significance of Alcatraz becomes most apparent when considered not as an anomaly, but as a crystallization. It distilled assumptions that had been forming within American governance since the 19th century, that social order could be stabilized through removal, that distance could neutralize disruption, and that visibility could substitute for spectacle. These assumptions did not originate on the island, they converged there. Throughout American history, confinement has often followed moments of perceived instability. Economic upheaval, political violence, and social change repeatedly prompted expansions of carceral authority. Alcatraz emerged at one such moment when fear of disorder threatened confidence in institutions. Its architecture did not merely respond to crime, it responded to anxiety. The island reassured the public that boundaries existed, that transgression had an endpoint. This reassurance was spatial. Unlike laws or policies, Alcatraz could be seen. It stood offshore as a permanent reminder that the state possessed a place beyond negotiation. The clarity of this message distinguished it from inland prisons. Alcatraz did not blend into its surroundings. It asserted itself against them. This assertion shaped its cultural resonance far beyond its operational lifespan. Yet clarity carries risk. When authority becomes too visible, it invites scrutiny. Alcatraz's prominence made it difficult to ignore ethical questions surrounding confinement. Its isolation drew attention to what was being isolated. Over time, this visibility transformed from asset to liability. The same qualities that made Alcatraz effective as a symbol of control eventually made it vulnerable to critique. The island's closure marked a turning point in how American institutions balanced visibility against endurance. Subsequent prisons were designed to function without symbolic prominence. They receded into landscapes of obscurity, protected from public imagination by distance and anonymity. Control became quieter, more procedural, less legible. Alcatraz's fate illustrated the cost of remaining too present. In memory, however, presence has proven durable. Alcatraz occupies a unique position precisely because it no longer exercises power. Freed from administrative necessity, it can be examined without immediate consequence. This distance allows reflection rather than reaction. The island becomes a space for inquiry rather than enforcement. The narratives associated with Alcatraz continue to evolve. Popular culture has often reduced it to myth, escape stories, notorious inmates, dramatic confrontations. Yet these narratives persist because they orbit a deeper truth. Alcatraz represented a limit. Whether imagined as inescapable or merely final, it defined where authority ended dialogue. This concept of a limit remains central to confinement policy. Every system of discipline requires an outer boundary to maintain coherence. Alcatraz fulfilled that role symbolically for decades. Its existence simplified governance elsewhere. Wardens could invoke it without resorting to force. Order was sustained through the possibility of removal rather than its constant execution. In this way, Alcatraz functioned as an invisible actor across the federal prison system. Even inmates who never saw the island were shaped by its reputation. Fear traveled farther than ferries ever could. The island's influence exceeded its population many times over. Understanding Alcatraz, then, requires attention to what it represented rather than what it contained. It was not defined by the men confined there, but by the function it served within a broader architecture of authority. Its cells held individuals, its meaning disciplined institutions. As Alcatraz recedes further into history, its relevance does not diminish. It sharpens. The island provides a reference point against which modern systems can be measured. It asks whether confinement today still relies on spatial clarity, or whether it has dissolved into mechanisms less accountable because they are less visible. Alcatraz does not offer resolution. It offers contrast. It stands as evidence that power once chose to reveal itself openly, and that this choice carried consequences. The island's legacy lies not in nostalgia for a harsher past, but in recognition of how authority adapts to scrutiny. The waters around Alcatraz remain cold. The currents remain strong. The distance remains unchanged. What has altered is the relationship between space and power. To stand on the island now is to confront a past that refuses simplification and a present that continues to negotiate the boundaries Alcatraz once made unmistakably clear. To trace the full evolution of American confinement through Alcatraz is to recognize that the island's power never resided solely in its walls, nor even in its isolation. It resided in the coherence between belief, design, and administration. Alcatraz worked because it aligned a cultural expectation that some forms of disorder required absolute removal, with a physical environment capable of sustaining that expectation without constant reinforcement. Few institutions achieve such alignment. Fewer still endure long enough to be examined after their authority has withdrawn. The island's effectiveness depended on its refusal to promise redemption. Unlike reform-oriented prisons of the progressive era, Alcatraz did not advertise rehabilitation as a central goal. It offered stability, containment, and predictability. This honesty distinguished it from institutions that claim moral transformation while delivering control. Alcatraz made no such claims. It existed to hold, not to heal. In doing so, it clarified the limits of what confinement could reasonably be expected to accomplish. This clarity resonates in retrospect. Much of the controversy surrounding modern incarceration stems from inflated expectations placed upon prisons to deter crime, rehabilitate individuals, stabilize communities, and resolve social inequality simultaneously. Alcatraz assumed none of these burdens. It addressed a narrow administrative problem: how to manage those who disrupted other systems of control. Its success and eventual obsolescence both stem from this specificity. As American society grew more complex, such narrow solutions became insufficient. Crime was no longer framed as an individual failure alone, but as a product of structural forces. Confinement expanded in response, absorbing populations far larger and more diverse than Alcatraz ever contained. The island's small scale, once a strength, became a limitation. Its model could not be replicated indefinitely without losing coherence. Yet the island's physical presence preserved what later systems diffused. Alcatraz allows contemporary observers to see how authority once organized itself spatially. It shows how architecture can encode certainty, how geography can replace spectacle, and how discipline can be maintained through inevitability rather than aggression. These insights remain relevant precisely because they are no longer obvious elsewhere. Walking through the cell house today, one encounters repetition without urgency. Rows of cells extend predictably, each indistinguishable from the next. This uniformity reveals a fundamental assumption embedded in the design: that individuality was irrelevant to the institution's purpose. Inmates were managed as variables within a system, not as narratives. Modern confinement continues this logic, albeit through data and classification, rather than stone and steel. The difference lies in legibility. Alcatraz externalized its assumptions. Modern prisons internalize them. The island therefore functions as a diagnostic tool, allowing observers to identify continuities that would otherwise remain abstract. It makes visible the mechanics of control that later institutions refined and concealed. Alcatraz also challenges the notion that harshness alone defines confinement. Its daily conditions were often more stable and predictable than those in overcrowded mainland prisons. Yet its psychological impact was profound. This distinction underscores a critical insight. Deprivation of agency can be more consequential than deprivation of comfort. Alcatraz removed unpredictability in exchange for total control. For many inmates, this trade proved unbearable. The island's legacy thus complicates simplistic narratives of punishment. It demonstrates that confinement operates along multiple dimensions: spatial, psychological, administrative, and that severity cannot be measured solely by material hardship. Alcatraz was severe because it was final, not because it was violent. As the island continues to age, its role as evidence becomes more pronounced. Each rusted bar and peeling surface testifies to a moment when authority believed permanence could be built. The decay does not diminish the lesson, it reinforces it. Power, like architecture, requires maintenance. When belief shifts, structures follow. Alcatraz endures not as a warning or a relic, but as a record. It records how a society once chose to draw its boundaries clearly, to place its limits within sight, and to accept the cost of doing so. The evolution of American confinement since then reflects different choices: less visible, more expansive, harder to trace. The island remains where it has always been, surrounded by water, suspended between past and present. Its distance from the shore is unchanged. What has changed is what that distance signifies. No longer an endpoint of tolerance, it has become a vantage point from which to examine the systems that replaced it. In this sense, Alcatraz continues to confine, not bodies, but attention. It holds questions in place, refusing to let them drift out of view. As long as those questions remain unresolved, the island's history will continue to matter. The story of Alcatraz ultimately converges on a broader reckoning with how societies remember institutions built for control. Memory does not preserve authority intact, it transforms it. In this transformation, Alcatraz sheds its operational purpose and becomes a frame through which later generations interpret the ethics of confinement. The island no longer enforces boundaries. It exposes how boundaries were once enforced. This exposure matters because confinement has always relied on moral distance as much as physical distance. Alcatraz minimized moral ambiguity by making its function explicit. It did not pretend to resolve social problems. It removed them from circulation. Modern systems, by contrast, often operate behind layers of rhetoric that obscure their true function. Alcatraz's bluntness now reads as clarity. The island's continued prominence in public imagination reflects a hunger for tangible reference points. Abstract systems are difficult to question. Physical places invite examination. Alcatraz allows visitors to stand where authority once stood, to occupy spaces once denied, and to sense how design influenced behavior. This embodied experience resists abstraction. It anchors discussion in material reality. The American landscape contains many former prisons, but few occupy this position. Alcatraz's isolation, visibility, and scale combined to create an institution that was legible even to those untouched by it. That legibility is its enduring contribution. It reminds observers that power once accepted accountability through presence. This acceptance was not benevolent. It was strategic. Visible authority could intimidate and reassure simultaneously. Alcatraz accomplished both. Its image deterred defiance while stabilizing public confidence. The island thus functioned as infrastructure not only for confinement, but for belief. It maintained trust in the system by demonstrating its capacity to act decisively. When that demonstration became unnecessary or politically costly, the institution receded. Authority adapted. What remained was the architecture, stripped of mandate, yet heavy with implication. Alcatraz's survival as a historic site ensures that this adaptation remains traceable. The island records a phase in governance when power still believed it could afford to be seen. This belief has not vanished entirely. It resurfaces during moments of crisis when visibility is again demanded. The island's history offers context for these cycles. It shows that confinement expands and contracts not only in response to crime, but in response to public anxiety and institutional confidence. Alcatraz rose when certainty was required and closed when certainty shifted elsewhere. The island also reframes the relationship between punishment and democracy. A system confident enough to display its limits invites debate. A system that conceals them avoids it. Alcatraz's visibility made it vulnerable to challenge, protest, and reinterpretation. Its closure did not eliminate confinement, but it altered how confinement could be contested. Today, Alcatraz functions as a site where these tensions can be held without resolution. It does not instruct visitors how to judge the past. It provides conditions for judgment to occur. This openness contrasts with the rigidity that once defined its operation. The island has exchanged enforcement for inquiry. In this exchange lies its final significance. Alcatraz demonstrates that institutions outlive their mandates but not their consequences. The physical remains continue to influence how power is understood. They remind observers that every system of control leaves traces, and that those traces shape future choices. The evolution of American confinement did not end with Alcatraz. It moved inward, expanded outward, and embedded itself within administrative frameworks. Yet the island remains a fixed point against which these developments can be measured. It marks a time when boundaries were drawn in space rather than code, when authority relied on geography rather than invisibility. Alcatraz endures because it refuses to become neutral. Even in preservation, it retains tension. The empty cells do not offer closure. They offer continuity. They connect past decisions to present realities, reminding visitors that confinement is never merely historical. It is ongoing, adaptive, and deeply tied to how societies organize power. Standing on the island today, one encounters absence layered with intention. The guards are gone. The inmates are gone. The routines have ended, yet the structure persists, insisting that the questions it embodies remain unanswered. Alcatraz no longer confines bodies, but it continues to confine narratives, holding them in place for examination. This is the island's final role within the evolution of American confinement, not as an endpoint, but as a measure. It measures what has changed, what has endured, and what remains unresolved. As long as societies continue to grapple with control, order, and exclusion, Alcatraz will remain relevant, not because it was extreme, but because it was clear. In its final assessment, Alcatraz reveals less about criminals than about confidence, specifically the confidence of a state willing to declare where its tolerance ended. The island's power was never unlimited. It was carefully bounded, deliberately narrow, and precisely located. Alcatraz did not claim to solve crime. It claimed only to contain its most disruptive expressions. That restraint, paradoxically, made it formidable. This restraint contrasts sharply with later expansions of confinement that pursued breadth rather than clarity. As incarceration widened across the 20th century, its purpose blurred. Prisons accumulated responsibilities they were never designed to fulfill. Alcatraz avoided this accumulation by remaining singular. It was not humane, but it was coherent. Its authority derived from that coherence. The island's closure did not signify moral progress or regression. It signaled transition. American confinement moved away from symbolic endpoints toward diffuse systems. Control became normalized, distributed across institutions, policies, and geographies. The clarity Alcatraz provided was exchanged for flexibility. This exchange allowed expansion without spectacle, but it also reduced transparency. Alcatraz thus occupies a unique moral position. It can be criticized without defensiveness because it no longer governs. It can be examined without fear of immediate consequence. This distance enables honesty. The island does not demand allegiance. It invites reckoning. That reckoning extends beyond prisons. Alcatraz illuminates how societies manage exclusion more broadly, how they decide who belongs within visible space and who must be removed from it. The logic that placed inmates on an island also shapes decisions about borders, surveillance, and access. Confinement is one expression of a wider impulse to resolve complexity through separation. The island's endurance underscores the persistence of this impulse. Even as methods change, The desire for clear boundaries remains. Alcatraz reminds observers that boundaries are never neutral. They are constructed, maintained, and eventually questioned. The island passed through each of these stages within a single century. As a historical artifact, Alcatraz resists simplification. It is neither villain nor victim. It is evidence. Evidence of how authority once manifested physically. Evidence of how belief shaped design. Evidence of how space disciplined behavior. Its lesson lies not in condemnation, but in clarity. The bay continues to move around the island, indifferent to its meanings. Tides erase nothing. They only surround. Alcatraz remains fixed, not because it is timeless, but because its questions persist. The evolution of American confinement continues elsewhere. Less visible, more complex, harder to trace. The island offers a vantage point from which that evolution can still be understood. Alcatraz began as a fort, became a prison, transformed into a protest site, and endures as a place of memory. Each phase reflects a different relationship between power and space. Together, they form a continuous narrative about how authority situates itself within the landscape. To understand Alcatraz is not to romanticize it, nor to dismiss it. It is to recognize that confinement has always been shaped as much by belief as by necessity. The island's architecture made those beliefs legible. Its preservation ensures they remain examinable. In the end, Alcatraz does not answer whether confinement is justified. It shows how it was justified. That distinction matters. It shifts focus from outcome to structure, from judgment to understanding. The island stands not as a conclusion, but as a lens, through which the evolution of American confinement can be seen with uncommon clarity. What remains after the architecture has been measured and the policies traced is a quieter realization. Alcatraz mattered because it made power finite. It drew a line. In doing so, it acknowledged that authority, like geography, has edges. This acknowledgement is rare in modern systems of control, which tend to expand without clearly defined limits. Alcatraz's existence depended on the opposite assumption, that power is strongest when it knows where it ends. The island embodied this philosophy physically. There was no ambiguity about its perimeter. Water surrounded it completely. Entry and exit were regulated, visible, ritualized. Unlike contemporary institutions that blur responsibility across agencies and procedures, Alcatraz centralized accountability. Decisions were concrete. Transfers were deliberate. Punishment had a location. This tangibility anchored authority in place. Such anchoring shaped public understanding. Citizens did not need to imagine where the most defiant prisoners were sent. They could see the destination from the shoreline. This visibility shortened the distance between governance and governed. It also constrained expansion. Alcatraz could not quietly grow. Its scale was fixed by rock and water. Its capacity was limited. In this sense, geography imposed discipline on the institution itself. Modern confinement lacks this constraint. Facilities multiply inland, absorbed into landscapes that conceal their function. Boundaries become administrative rather than physical. Capacity expands through zoning rather than stone. Alcatraz's island status prevented such diffusion. It was incapable of becoming invisible. That inability now appears instructive. The island's preservation has transformed it into a site where these contrasts can be observed without urgency. Visitors are not compelled to draw conclusions, but they are exposed to structure. They encounter how confinement once operated when it was forced to declare itself openly. This encounter fosters a form of historical literacy that statistics alone cannot provide. Alcatraz's narrative also complicates assumptions about progress. Closure did not eliminate confinement, it reconfigured it. Authority did not retreat, it redistributed. The disappearance of visible endpoints did not signal resolution, only adaptation. Alcatraz helps make this distinction legible by providing a before against which the after can be measured. The island's legacy therefore lies less in what it did than in what it reveals. It reveals how societies externalize fear, how they spatialize uncertainty, and how they construct places to absorb what they cannot integrate. Alcatraz absorbed disruption so that order elsewhere could appear intact. Its removal redistributed that burden. This redistribution has consequences. When boundaries dissolve into systems, responsibility diffuses. Alcatraz concentrated responsibility geographically. Someone decided who went there. Someone signed the orders. Someone maintained the walls. This concentration made authority traceable. Modern systems, by contrast, often obscure decision-making behind processes. Standing on Alcatraz today, one confronts this contrast intuitively. The clarity of the space highlights the opacity of what followed. The island's starkness sharpens awareness of how much contemporary confinement relies on abstraction. Alcatraz teaches not through instruction, but through absence. In this way, the island continues to perform a civic function. It preserves not only structures, but questions about governance. It reminds observers that every system of control carries assumptions about human behavior, responsibility, and order. Those assumptions shape architecture, policy, and memory alike. Alcatraz does not argue that confinement was better in the past. It demonstrates that it was different, and that those differences matter. By making authority visible, the island invited scrutiny. By withdrawing visibility, later systems reduced it. The trade-off between efficiency and accountability remains unresolved. As long as societies continue to confine, Alcatraz will remain relevant, not as a model to replicate, but as a reference to interrogate. Its endurance ensures that the evolution of American confinement can be traced not only through documents and data, but through space itself. The island stands unchanged in the bay, yet altered by meaning. It no longer enforces order. It preserves insight. In doing so, it fulfills a final role that no active institution can. It allows power to be studied after it has stepped aside. At the furthest reach of its meaning, Alcatraz stands as a study in deliberate limitation. It reveals a moment when confinement was designed to be comprehensible, when power accepted the discipline of geography, scale, and exposure. The island's authority depended on these constraints. It could not sprawl. It could not multiply unnoticed. It could only endure so long as belief, design, and administration remained aligned. When that alignment fractured, the institution ended. This ending offers a lesson that extends beyond prisons. Systems built on clarity eventually confront their own visibility. They invite judgment precisely because they declare themselves openly. Alcatraz accepted that risk. Its closure reflects not only economic calculation, but a broader retreat from visible boundaries toward flexible, procedural control. The island's fate marks the point where American confinement chose efficiency over legibility. Yet legibility has its own power. Alcatraz's continued presence in the public imagination demonstrates that what is seen can be remembered, debated, and reinterpreted. The island's architecture holds memory in place, preventing easy amnesia. Rusted bars and narrow cells resist abstraction. They insist that confinement once had a face, a place, and a perimeter. In this insistence lies Alcatraz's enduring relevance. It provides a stable reference against which shifting policies can be evaluated. As confinement evolves, through technology, classification, and dispersed geography, the island remains fixed. It allows comparison across eras, not by offering answers, but by preserving form. The distance to shore remains constant. The currents remain strong. The boundary remains visible. Alcatraz does not resolve the tension between order and liberty. It clarifies it. By externalizing control, the island made the trade-offs explicit. Safety was purchased with separation. Stability was purchased with exclusion. These costs were not hidden. They were embedded in stone and water. Modern systems distribute the same costs more subtly, often without a single place to examine them. The island's preservation ensures that such examination remains possible. Visitors move through spaces once designed to deny movement. They occupy cells once meant to empty identity. This inversion does not erase the past, it renders it intelligible. Alcatraz becomes a classroom without lectures, a record without verdicts. In the long arc of American confinement, Alcatraz is neither origin nor endpoint. It is a hinge, a point at which authority turned from visible limits toward diffuse administration. Understanding this hinge clarifies how control adapts to scrutiny, how it trades presence for persistence. The island story is therefore not one of exceptional cruelty, but of exceptional clarity. As the ferry departs and the island recedes, Its outline remains sharp against the water. The city grows closer. Movement resumes, yet the memory of stillness lingers. Alcatraz continues to do what it always did best: hold a boundary steady long enough to be seen. There is a final dimension of Alcatraz that emerges only when the island is considered in silence, apart from policy debates and historical narrative. It is the dimension of restraint, not the restraint imposed on those confined, but the restraint exercised by the institution itself. Alcatraz did not expand endlessly. It did not reinvent its purpose to justify survival. When its function no longer aligned with its cost and context, it ended. In that decision lies a rare example of institutional self-limitation. This restraint stands in contrast to the inertia that characterizes many systems of control. Institutions often persist long after their rationale has weakened, sustained by bureaucracy, fear, or habit. Alcatraz resisted this tendency not because it was enlightened, but because it was bounded. Geography enforced discipline upward as well as downward. The island could not accommodate excess. Its limits were physical, undeniable, and final. These limits shaped how authority behaved. Decisions about confinement carried weight precisely because capacity was finite. Each transfer to Alcatraz required justification. Each occupied cell represented a deliberate choice. This scarcity reinforced seriousness. Confinement was not casual, it was reserved. Modern systems, by contrast, often operate at scales that dilute responsibility. When capacity is vast, decision-making becomes routine. Alcatraz's smallness prevented that normalization. The island therefore illustrates an often overlooked relationship between scale and ethics. When institutions are forced to remain small, their actions are more visible and their consequences more immediate. Alcatraz did not become humane because it was small, but it became accountable. That accountability, however limited, shaped its legacy. As Alcatraz passed into history, its physical constraints became conceptual ones. The island now limits how the past can be forgotten. It anchors memory. Its presence resists the abstraction that allows systems of control to fade into statistics. Visitors do not encounter charts or algorithms. They encounter walls, doors, and distance. These encounters restore proportion. They remind observers that confinement is always embodied. This embodiment challenges contemporary discourse. Discussions of incarceration often occur at levels removed from physical experience. Alcatraz reintroduces scale, texture, and spatial consequence. It asks observers to consider how environments influence behavior, how architecture communicates intent, and how design can both constrain and expose power. The island's continued relevance lies in this exposure. It does not argue for or against confinement. It demonstrates how confinement once operated when it accepted the burden of visibility. This demonstration provides a standard against which opacity can be measured. It allows questions to be framed not only in moral terms, but in spatial ones. In the end, Alcatraz's greatest significance may be that it ended at all. Its closure acknowledged that no institution should be immune to reassessment. The island did not collapse under scandal or revolt. It concluded under review. That conclusion preserved coherence. It allowed Alcatraz to transition from instrument to evidence without rupture. The ferry routes remain. The shoreline remains. The distance remains. Alcatraz continues to occupy the same coordinates, yet its function has inverted. Where it once absorbed uncertainty, it now concentrates reflection. Where it once enforced silence, it now invites inquiry. This inversion is not accidental. It is the final consequence of an institution that accepted limits. In tracing the complete history of Alcatraz Island and the evolution of American confinement, one arrives not at judgment, but at perspective. The island clarifies how power once chose to situate itself, how it adapted when scrutiny intensified, and how it retreated into systems less visible but more expansive. Alcatraz remains as a marker of that transition, a fixed point in a moving landscape. Its story does not end with closure, preservation, or interpretation. It continues wherever confinement is debated without reference to place, wherever control operates without acknowledgement of boundary. Alcatraz endures because it refuses to disappear into abstraction. It remains concrete, legible, and unresolved. In the end, Alcatraz does not stand as a relic of cruelty, nor as a monument to justice. It stands as a record of intent. It records a moment when American authority chose to make its limits explicit, to anchor discipline in geography, and to accept the cost of being seen. That choice shaped everything that followed, from how prisons were built to how power learned to withdraw from view. The island's history reveals that confinement has never been only about those confined. It has always been about those who decide where boundaries lie. Alcatraz made that decision visible. It placed authority offshore, within sight of everyday life, forcing the public to acknowledge the existence of an outer edge. The prison's power derived from this acknowledgement as much as from steel or stone. As confinement evolved, that edge dissolved. Boundaries multiplied inland. Control expanded through systems rather than symbols. Alcatraz became unnecessary not because confinement softened, but because it learned to operate without declaring itself. The island's closure marked the end of an era in which power accepted the burden of legibility. Yet legibility has proven resilient. Alcatraz remains because it can still be read. Its architecture continues to speak even when authority is absent. The narrow cells, the measured corridors, the surrounding water, all preserve a language of control that modern institutions rarely articulate so clearly. This clarity gives the island its enduring gravity. To walk through Alcatraz today is to encounter the physical vocabulary of American confinement at a moment of coherence. The island does not ask for condemnation or admiration. It asks for attention. It insists that power, when given form, can be examined, and that when it withdraws from form, it becomes harder to confront. Alcatraz's place in history is therefore neither central nor marginal. It is diagnostic. It allows the evolution of confinement to be traced not as a moral arc, but as an architectural and administrative one. It shows how authority adapts when visibility becomes costly, and how it trades presence for persistence. The island remains fixed while meanings shift around it. The currents still circle, the distance still separates. What has changed is what that separation represents. Once it marked finality, now it marks perspective. Alcatraz has become a vantage point from which the mechanisms of control, past and present, can be understood more clearly. In telling the complete history of Alcatraz Island and the evolution of American confinement, the lesson that endures is not about escape or endurance, but about boundaries, who draws them, where they are placed, and what happens when societies stop insisting that those boundaries be seen. Alcatraz endures because it refuses to let that question fade.